Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Michaela Peters. Today I'm going to be talking to you a bit about how as a foreign national you might be able to someday work for NASA. While I will be transparent in saying that this is by no means an easy process, it's definitely not an impossible process. One thing that I did just verify because I wasn't completely sure about this, NASA has a lot of contractors, and be mindful that contractors do also work on site at NASA. As I mentioned in my All About NASA video, in order to work for NASA, you do have to be a US citizen. And in fact, I used to bring friends on site at NASA and give them tours, and I didn't realize that the friends that I was bringing on site had to be US citizens. And something that I also ignorantly did not realize is that not every single one of my friends who lives in the US, who grew up in the US, is a US citizen, because a lot of times people simply have working papers and their parents aren't citizens, or they weren't born in the US, or the way that they came to the US was not a way that allowed them to have US citizenship. Which, the process is usually like you get a green card, then you get citizenship. And to be very honest, I don't know so much about how this works from a US perspective. I know more about how it works from a Finnish perspective, since that's more relevant to me, and I would like to someday have Finnish citizenship. However, one thing that I do know is, for instance, if I wanted to work in a US embassy in another country, I would have to denounce my other citizenship. So it's one thing that I think about, since I had been interested in a career with the Foreign Service. It's hardly at some point, but at this point, I'm not necessarily looking too strongly into that for the time being. Okay, so a contractor would be easier because you could have working papers, I believe, and work for a contractor or some other means of allowing you to stay in the country that is not necessarily just citizenship. So you do need to be a citizen to work for NASA, a US citizen. I do have one friend, for instance, who I worked with at NASA, who was from Bangladesh, and she was born in Bangladesh, and eventually she got her US citizenship and worked for NASA. Prior to being a civil servant, is what it's called, so a government employee, she was working for a contractor. So again, this is another means by which, you can start as a contractor, and then you can become a civil servant who actually works for NASA. One thing is you usually get paid less working for NASA, but you have more job security and you have more job benefits, mostly related to healthcare and your retirement savings. So if I were a Russian person, for instance, studying in Russia, and I already had decently good English skills and some good academic accolades, or impressive accolades rather, one thing that I would start with, and this is my opinion because I'm a very debt-averse person, if it would be possible, I would want to apply directly to a PhD program. And this is also assuming that, I have more of an engineering background or physics, or usually engineering is the thing that people come into NASA with. I know there are some physicists who work there, but they're definitely not the majority. And of course, some business people, like I technically was when I worked there. So you could come to the US with a master's degree. Now, master's degree programs are even more expensive than bachelor's degree programs in the US. Yes, they're shorter and they're only 2 years, but the tuition seems to be twice the amount for some reason. So I'm not sure I would necessarily recommend a master's program if I could get into a PhD program. PhD programs will pay you to study. For transparency, also, you will usually be making a salary that I want to say is around $30,000 or $40,000 a year, which may sound like a lot to anybody outside the US, but for people living in the US who know how expensive the cost of living is here, that is very much so a simple life where you're skating by and being very careful with managing your finances. However, you do have job prospects after in the US where you could earn more money, so suffering temporarily the way that, I think a lot of people do when they go to college in the US and then hope that they're going to get a better job after. So that would be my advice, is to get into a PhD program. Now, how does one get into a PhD program? Actually, I do know a little bit about this because I have a friend right now who's interested in doing this, and I was at a conference recently for work, and there was a woman there who was from Russia. Then she did her master's degree in Israel, so I think she did her bachelor's in Russia, her master's in Israel, and then her PhD in the US, and I asked her, what was that process like getting in? And the thing that she told me was, her advice, you find whatever your niche is and find a professor that matches that in terms of research. So I would also advise that you already have some sort of research that you've done in Russia, like academic papers that you've worked to publish. And you would then scout for some sort of professor who matches your line of interest and some of the research or the work that you've already done. And of course, they always say that with PhDs, you should be relatively passionate about your work because it is a long and draining, strenuous process. So the more passionate you can feel about your topic, the better. So you would then reach out to, sorry, the dog is being fidgety today. You will then reach out to that professor and say, these are all the reasons why I would like you to consider me for research. And then once you find that professor, you're pretty much a shoo-in at that university and applying and getting in. A lot of U.S. universities for PhD programs do have what are they called? Not entry fees, application fees, sorry, that are like $125, for example. I know that's one of the ones I looked at was about that much. So it's a lot more, resource saving smarts kind of thing to find the professor you're going to work with or that wants you, and then apply for the university, because then it's almost guaranteed that you get into the university. So I would start with a PhD track. You obviously come on a visa, and at some point, I think if you are able to get employment, they probably give you a green card at some point, and then eventually, over a certain amount of time, you can then get citizenship. I have a Kyrgyz host family I lived with when I was in Kyrgyzstan who won the green card lottery, and I know they've been here for how long now? 6 years. And I think they were working on getting citizenship last year. So, it just takes some years, but it's definitely possible. And then at that point, you could apply for working at NASA. I got in through the Pathways program, and this is something that I've been seeing a lot of, is that with entry-level stuff, it is really hard for people to get in without already having interned at the place that they're trying to get an entry-level job at. So I would more so utilize my connections probably to get whatever job first lands in my lap, and then from there, eventually, once I have more experience, keep up with NASA job announcements and then start applying from there. So I think that's kind of everything that I have to say advice-wise. Oh yeah, and of course, looking for work with a NASA contractor, that's usually an easier way to get in with the NASA work without directly being a NASA employee first. So I don't think it's by any means impossible, but you do have to be sort of, okay, this might be an exaggeration, but academic powerhouse type of person, or, like NASA's full of a bunch of nerds. I don't know what else to say. That's just how it is. A lot of, science engineering people. So, if you're into that, you'll fit right in. But, yeah, I would probably advocate for the PhD program as being one of the easiest ways to get in. I know that there's an issue in general with not a lot of Americans want to go into PhD programs because, like I explained, they don't pay a lot relative to what, some sort of entry-level job would pay. And they do, I would say, hire a lot of foreign talent. And it is an easy way to get into the US. I mean, that's the same reason why I have intentions of doing a PhD program in Finland, because I'm foreign and it's the easiest way for me to, I guess, the path of least resistance for me to be able to maintain my Finnish residency so that I can eventually get something that's more permanent, like a green card, and maybe eventually citizenship. So, I can approach it from both that angle and the angle of what I know based on how it would work here in the US theoretically. So I made this video very specifically for one person who asked me this question, and I saw the email this morning, so I hope this answers it. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions related to NASA. This one I kind of, was based more so on knowledge from other people or what I've seen, less so than my own experience. So in any event, I hope it was helpful. And also, I guess a note on this is I've decided I'm going to give myself breaks on weekends because, making these videos can be kind of tiring sometimes. And just takes time, which, yeah, sometimes there's not a lot of that in the US, so that's another thing to get used to. Ugh. Anyway, alright, well, I wish everybody a very nice weekend, that you can relax from whatever jobs you're doing during the week, or if you work on weekends, that you still somehow find a way to relax. And until my next video, okay, thank you, and have a nice weekend, everybody. Bye!